right, well, this morning my ongoing concern and interest with the Disney movie Tangled continues before you. I want to talk to you about that. It's the traditional story of Rapunzel, you know, the girl who was snatched away, the baby who was snatched away from her crib by an evil woman who wanted to stay young forever. And so the power is in Rapunzel's hair, and so she snatches her away and steals her off to a castle. She's locked in the tower, but every year on her birthday, you remember the story, if you've seen Tangled, the lights go up. The lantern lights go up in the sky, and this is the beacon from her true family to draw her back home. And so you have this kind of stupid thief, but handsome thief, Flynn Rider, who actually goes into the tower and he rescues Rapunzel and he helps her to go see the lantern lights, and she sees them, and the end of the movie is that she is reunited with her family. That's it. That's the story. But not quite, is because in 2010 there was this 6-minute video released, this 6-minute movie called Tangled Ever After. And Tangled Ever After was the account of the picture of Flynn Rider and Rapunzel's wedding. It's hilarious. You've got to go look at it on YouTube, this 6-minute clip. But I don't know if it was for you. I mean, it's one of my favorite movies. If whenever Indy wants to sit down and watch a movie, that is the one that I pick that I want to sit down and watch with her. I just love it. It captures my imagination. But then this article came out shortly after the 6-minute video, which said, why did Disney never make Tangled 2? And the creator said, well, it was quite simple, is that he said that if he thinks that sequels are fine if there's a story. If there's a reason for a story, he thinks that sequels are fine. But the story had already found its reason. It had already accomplished its purpose. You see, she'd already been reunited back with her family. She was apart from them, but she'd been reunited. She had long flowing blonde hair because she lived in a tower, but now she's got the short brown pixie cut. She doesn't need it anymore. You know, she was with her man. She was with her family. The evil mother had dissipated into dust. And so there's no need for the story. The city was happy. The story had found its reason. Now, I like that answer. Because how many times have you loved a movie and then they brought out the sequel and it was just horrible and it ruins the original story? You see, the point is this. When stories find their true reason, nothing else needs to be said. When stories find their true reason, nothing else needs to be said. When people find their true reason, nothing else matters. When you find your true reason, nothing else matters. And I want you to ask yourself this question this morning. Inside your heart, inside your mind, have I found my true reason? Have you found it? Your very purpose for living. Have you found your true reason? It must be a question that goes on in each of your mind at various times in your life. Have I found my true reason? Well, this is the centerpiece of the book that we're starting today. The very heart of the book that we're starting with John. And so with a few breaks in between, I'm not just going to kind of hit it every week, but with a few breaks in between, we're going to go all the way through the Gospel of John, and we're going to finish it at Easter time next year. And I believe it's going to shape us. I believe it's going to teach us so much. It is going to be powerful for our lives. But John, the best friend of Jesus, he writes in John 20 verse 30, I've got it up on the screen here. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. No sequel needed. But these are written so that you may believe. These are written so that you may believe. The word believe, it's said 98 times in John's gospel. This is so central, this is so core to his idea of writing a gospel, is that you would believe. It's only a handful of times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John says it 98 times. Now, this is true of John's life. It was true of the time that he wrote. He wrote this gospel between AD 80 and AD 90, and it was a time of instability. Because in AD 70, the temple at Jerusalem was destroyed. And the temple was significant to the believer's life at that time. This was the mindset. If there's no temple, then there's no worship. If there's no worship, then there's no connection to God. And so this was the instability that was in the believer's life. And so John is actually saying to them, no, the temple is not your reason for life. Your reason is to believe and to have life. So I've called this series The Invitation, because this is John's purpose, to invite you to believe, to invite you to come and see your true purpose, come and see your reason, come and see life. Now, John didn't only just write this in a time of instability, he also wrote it in a time of competing ideology. So back in the first century, there were schools, there were universities just like there are today. And these schools and universities, they would compete for the educated people of the time. And basically you had two kind of schools. You had the Epicureans and you had the Stoics. So the Epicurean reason for living was essentially pleasure. It was essentially this idea that everything is just matter. Everything is just atoms. Everything is just molecules. And so basically what you do is you receive pleasure through your senses, through what you can see, taste, touch, hear, smell. And so the whole purpose in the Epicurean way of life is to do what? Is, of course, to fill up your senses, to actually experience pleasure in this life. And so what they would do is they would take everything outside of them to fill up the inside of them. But the Stoics said, no, that's not it. It's not about pleasure. It's actually about living life in agreement with the natural order. It's about not disrupting the natural order, living in morality so that you don't interrupt other people. And so what the Stoics would do is that they would look inside themselves for truth to make sense of the outside of them. And so the Epicureans said, we take what's outside to fill up the inside, and the Stoics said, no, we look in the inside to make sense of the outside. And so in Stoicism, you essentially just lived like there are no real answers. Like there actually aren't any real answers at all. You be good, you be strong, you be moral, and you do what is complementary with the natural order. But the question that I have to that is, how do you cope with real life? How do you cope with real life? If you're an Epicurean, you search for more pleasure. If you're a Stoic, you take a walk, you hug a child, you read a good book about making yourself better. Now, the thing is they're not completely wrong, are they? Those things are not completely wrong. This is the thing about philosophies and ideology. They're never completely wrong. There's actually a lot of truth in these things. We actually do want to be people. We don't live in a pleasureless world. We actually live in a world of great pleasure, where there's great things that we should experience and enjoy. And we also don't demonize moral keeping. We don't demonize not living with the natural order and not disrupting the world. But not everything is true either about them. But the real problem with these things is quite simply this. Reality keeps breaking into them. Reality keeps coming in. You know, that pesky, annoying thing called reality keeps hitting them. You know, I saw this pop up in my Facebook feed yesterday. It's from Richard Gere. It's on the front, right? Richard Gere, handsome movie star, you know, influencer of our world. And he said this: none of us are getting out of here alive, so please stop treating yourself like an afterthought. Eat the delicious food, walk in the sunshine, jump in the ocean, say the truth that you're carrying in your heart like hidden treasure. Be silly, be kind, be weird. There's no time for anything else. That's the road to peace. He's not completely wrong, is he? There's some truth. There's some truth in those things, to walk in the sunshine, jump in the ocean, to fully embrace this life. What's his central message? His message is don't waste your life. You've got one life, don't waste it. Enjoy what you have. There's some truth in here, but Richard, reality keeps breaking in. Reality keeps coming into this and just not quite giving me the answer. If I'm an Epicurean, I seek pleasure, but my pleasure seeking, I kind of consume, and then once I've consumed, it's done, it's gone, and then I seek the next thing, and it just doesn't quite work. You know, if I'm a Stoic, then my moral keeping makes me feel good for a while, but eventually I explode. Eventually I can never do enough good to make myself happy. You know, in fact, we are so contradictory in our life that we actually do a bit of both. So we actually spend a lot of our lives seeking pleasure and living for ourselves and all that sort of stuff. And then on the other hand, we also do the moral keeping, and we point at the people who are pleasure seeking. This is how kind of corrupt we are. And so what ends up happening is that we find that we don't actually have any real answers. You know, people find these days, they know these things to be true. We know we're selfish, and we know we're moralists, that we like to elevate ourselves above other people. And so what it does actually inside of us is it makes us realize, I don't actually have any real answers. I can't make sense of this world. And you think about it, why is it impolite to bring up religion or faith at a dinner table these days? Why is that impolite? The reason is because essentially what you're doing, there could be many reasons, but at the core of it is that essentially what you are making people do is confront their reality, that they don't really have real answers, that they don't have real answers for this life. And so John, he wrote his gospel into this time of ancient Greek philosophy, and he said there is actually an answer. In John 1:1, there is actually an answer, and the answer is the Word. The Word. This is kind of a strange answer. What does he mean? There is an answer. The answer is the Word. Now, there's two possible reasons. There's two possible meanings for this word, the Word. For in the ancient Greeks that we just talked about, they had this understanding of the word. It was very powerful to them. So there was this philosopher called Heraclides. He was the one that Socrates and Aristotle formed their ideas from. But Heraclides, he looked at the world and he saw it was in a constant state of change, a constant state of chaos, and he couldn't make sense of it. And so they came up with this idea, this word called the Logos. The Logos, it was this idea of the divine, this divine force, this divine power that somehow made sense of the world. So this is the ancient Greek idea. The Logos, it was very powerful to them. If you look at ancient Greek writings, you will see this everywhere, this concept of the Logos. But then also the other view of it was the Hebrew view. The Hebrews, which is John's actual heritage, was the Jews, was the Hebrew. They actually had this concept of the Word too. In the Old Testament scriptures, that was the Word of God that spoke. They also had this concept of God's speech as the Word. They knew Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So their concept of the Word, that it was the effective speech of God. And so you have these kind of two views, a divine force and the effective speech of God, the Old Testament scriptures. And so what is John's job here with his gospel? His job is to try and take these two worlds and pull them together to make sense of a real reason for living with these two views. And so what does John do? Well, he builds a bridge by using their word, their very word, the Logos. He says this, in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Logos. Now, everyone's okay at this point. The Hebrews are okay. They're like, yeah, in the beginning was the Word. I believe that. The effective speech of God, which made light come into existence. And the ancient Greeks are saying, yeah, I agree with that. In the beginning was the Word, a divine force that makes sense of everything. Everything's okay, but then John blows them away because he says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You see, the Word is not just the effective speech of God, it's not just the Old Testament scriptures, and it certainly isn't just a divine force. The Word is a person. The Word is Jesus. Listen, people, he says. Listen, people, the Word is Jesus, and therefore Jesus is your reason. Jesus is your very reason for living. You see, if you're an Epicurean, reality keeps breaking into your pleasure seeking. And if you're a Stoic, reality keeps breaking into your moral keeping. But John says Jesus is reality, and he broke into the world. He actually became flesh. This is the message of Christianity. Look down with me in verse 14. It says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus, who was in the beginning with God and was God, became flesh. He is reality. 2,000 years ago, in our world, Jesus broke through into reality and he died on the cross for our sin. He is the Son of God. He is God in the flesh. You know, I had this conversation a couple of years ago with a Jehovah's Witness who came to my door. It was a great conversation. He was trying, I think, though, to align his beliefs with mine. He was almost trying to disguise his beliefs until I opened up to John 1:1:1 and I said, "Who is the Word?" And he replied, "Jesus." And I said, "Who is Jesus to you?" And he said, "Savior." And I thought, okay, he's trying to get me here. And I said, "No, okay, what does John 1:1 say in your Bible?" And this is where you see the departure of truth. It says, "The Word was with God and the Word was a God." You see, all throughout history, John's claim here in John 1:1 has been attacked. Almost as soon as it was written, it has been attacked. People have been trying to tear down this claim, but there is no mistaking here in the Greek that John was saying in the context here that he is equating Jesus with God himself, that Jesus is God. You know, and so there's many other religions, many other faiths which insert the word Jesus was a God. He had divine qualities. But John is not saying that. He has gone to great lengths in the wording here to say that Jesus is God. Paul says it in Colossians. He describes Jesus as the prototokos, the firstborn. Now, everyone looks at that and they say, see, Jesus is the firstborn. He was the first one created. But you see, what Paul was saying here is that Jesus this isn't talking about birth order. This is talking about rank. And you see this, David, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, David is described as the prototokos, as the firstborn. But we know David was the youngest of the sons. He was the youngest of Jesse's sons. And so the prototokos here, when Paul says it, is he is talking about Jesus being the highest in rank. Come and see greatness. Come and see that Jesus is divine. He is God. Paul says it. John says it. All of the early church said it. You know, the early church would not have accepted John's gospel in the canon if they knew John to be saying that Jesus was just a God. They would not have accepted it. This, you go back into the early literature, the church believed in their verbal theology that Jesus is God, that he was God. And so John would have never made it into the Bible. John's point was that Jesus is God. Now, many people say something to the effect like this, that faith is pathetic. Faith is pathetic compared to evidence and reason. Have you heard this? You know, everyone wants evidence and reason, but you know what? John is a guy of reason and evidence. You know, John, the other name for the Gospel of John is called the Book of Signs. Look back to this purpose, or the purpose that I said at the beginning. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe. What were written? Signs were written. Evidence was given. So we become Christians by faith. We know this. We become Christians by faith. But John expressly wrote his gospel to provide evidence of who Jesus is. So the Christian faith is a thinking person's faith. It's not baseless, it's not foolish. There are reasons to believe, and this is the whole purpose of John's gospel. He is inviting you to come and see, inviting you to come and see the signs and to see true greatness. I want to ask you that this morning, whether it's faded in you or whether you've never experienced your reason before. Do you have a true reason for living? When you think about it, when you put your head down on the pillow at night, when something comes into your life, when reality breaks in, do you know you have a reason? What does that mean? What does that mean that Jesus is your logos? That he's your word? That he's your reason? What are the implications of that? What does it actually mean? Let's have a look in verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. I want you to imagine this. You're sitting down with a group of people to read and discuss a poem. Imagine you're sitting in a circle and you're discussing a poem. Everyone's asking and discussing what they think the poem means. And so one person says, yeah, I think the poem means this. I think this is what the author was saying. And then another person says, no, I think that what he was saying was this. And it goes around and everyone's got a different view on what it means. But then imagine that into that group walks the author. And the author says, yeah, I wrote that poem 20 years ago, and this is what I meant when I wrote it. Well, there's no more discussion after that, is there? That's it. It's not like you can sit up there and go, no, you didn't. You didn't write it like that. You wrote it for this. No, the author walked in and said the reason that he wrote it, and that's final. That's the end. You see, they found their reason right there in that moment because the author walked in, and the author was the authority. You know, this is true for us. We find our reason. This is what it means to make Jesus your reason. We find our reason when we find our author, and the author becomes our authority. John says, all things were made through him. He is the author. You know, I before you and I were conceived in the womb, we did not exist, in essence. We did not exist. We had a birth date with our mums, and we became flesh, but not Jesus. He was born to the Virgin Mary, but he existed in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him. That makes him the very author of life. The very author of life. Now, we can go around saying that Jesus is your reason, but if you don't know and believe that he's the very author of your life, then you won't make him the authority on your life. He has to become the authority on your life. But this has to match with reality, right? Remember, we're talking about reality breaking in. Does it match with reality? It does, but think about the poem. We can debate our reason over and over and over again, what it means for you, what it means for anyone else. But when the author walks in and gives the final word, there's the authority. That gives the answer to reason. Now, we do live in a time which turns its nose up at authority. We're not interested in our authority. To make Jesus your authority, though, it has to mean something. What does it mean for your sexual capacity? Think about this. What does it mean for your sexual capacity? You hear this thrown around these days. Nobody tells me what I do with my body. Nobody tells me. I control my body. I control what I do. But Jesus being your author and your authority means that's not true. It means that your sexual capacity is different now. It's changed. You have a new capacity. You use it to glorify him and to worship him and to live out his word. What does it mean for your intellectual capacity? No one tells me how to think. I think the way I think how I want to. What about your resource capacity? No one tells me how to spend my money. But what it means that Jesus is your logos, your word, your reason, is that because he is your author, he is your authority on everything. Put it this way, he is the first and the final word on your life. Now, I think John says this later in the book of Revelation. He's the author of Revelation too. He is telling people about the end and what happens for those who do not make him the first and final word on their life. He says he's the Alpha, he's the beginning, he's the Omega, he's the end, he's the first, he's the last. This is totally in line with John's theology, that Jesus is central to everything. Jesus is our reason. And so finally, I want to just say as we close, how do you do that? How do you actually do that? How do you make Jesus your authority? How do you recognize him as your author and then make him your authority? And I want to address that to two groups this morning. I want to address that to those of you who have never actually seen Christ to be the author and the authority on your life. You've never done that. And then secondly, to those who you have believed that before, but it's completely faded in your life. You know that Jesus is the author, but he has not been the authority in your life. The thing that you say to yourself most is that no one tells me how I should live my life. How can you make Jesus the first and final word on your life Well, here it is. You have to let light come in. Light has to come in to your darkness. No one can actually do that for you. In verse 4, John says, in him, in Jesus, was life. And the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You see, the only way that you can deal with the problem of reality breaking in and making you believe that life is only about pleasure or keeping the natural order is that light has to break into your darkness. It actually has to come in. It mean that Jesus breaks into your darkness. Isaiah 55, verse 11, back in the Old Testament, the Lord said, my word that goes out from my mouth, it shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. This is true. The word came, it broke into reality. Jesus came into reality 2,000 years ago. The Logos, the very reason for living. He broke into this dark, sinful world, broke into reality, and he died on the cross for our sins, for the sins of humanity for all time. But even then, he took darkness upon himself, and the darkness did not overcome him. He rose again. Light defeats the darkness. Darkness cannot extinguish the light. You see, God's word does not return to him empty. It accomplished his purpose for which he sent it. To redeem a lost and broken world and to present Jesus as your very reason for living. That if you believe and seek forgiveness of your sin, there is life. It says, in him was life. Now, I just want to say that to you this morning. Nobody can do that for you. Nobody can make Jesus your authority. Light has to come in. Once you've found your reason, nothing else needs to be said. The final word is spoken on your life. The first word has already been spoken. Jesus is the author of your life. Our job is to make him the final word on our life. When you do that, there is great security in that. We can often spend our lives, trying to create that false reason, like the movie producers do. They try and create a false reason to continue the story going, and the story ends up going nowhere. But when you make him the final word, nothing else needs to be said on your life. You are secure. You are with him for eternity. All of a sudden, nothing else matters to you. He is your reason. One of the greatest thinkers, I said to you today that the Christian faith is a thinking person's faith. One of the greatest thinkers of the last century, C.S. Lewis, he described himself as the reluctant convert. He was a hardened atheist. He fought against Christians. He mocked. He laughed. He struggled to find truth. And this is what he came to believe. He came to believe in this actual concept of the meaninglessness of life. That's what he had landed on. And he believed that we needed to build our lives on the basis of unyielding despair. That was his idea. But one day, while riding on a bus in Oxford, Lewis had the sense that he was holding something at bay. He was shutting something out. What does that mean? Reality kept breaking in. Reality kept breaking into his life. His idea to accept meaninglessness just didn't work for him. He could either open the door or he could let it stay shut. And he finally submitted himself to God, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. This man named Walter Hooper called Lewis the most thoroughly converted man I ever met after that. His journey from atheist to reluctant convert to influential writer, perhaps the greatest writer in our time, not just in Christianity, but in the whole world. It was something beyond even this guy's imagination. His whole life changed. He faced the death of his wife after only 3 years of marriage. But he was able to do that because he had a new reason. He had a reason for living. Jesus had broken into his darkness. Jesus had become his word, his logos. Now, maybe that is you today. You are a reluctant person. You've heard the truth this morning, but you are reluctant to actually let him in. like C.S. Lewis, you feel like there's something that is not right. You feel like you haven't necessarily found your reason, and there is something holding you back from actually opening up your heart. How do you let the light in? You have to believe these verses. That's what you have to do this morning. If you want to let the light in, you have to believe. You have to decide in your heart to believe that in the beginning was the Word, Jesus, who is your reason, who's the author, who's the first word and must become the final word on your life. Let's just bow our heads. And I just want us to think about this morning. If you have forgotten that Jesus is your reason, then I want to invite you this morning, just like John invites us through his gospel, to believe again, to let faith reign in your heart again. And this morning, if you are here and you have never ever found your reason, you know in your heart that you have not found your reason, I want to do what John does this morning as well and invite you to believe. Will you believe that Jesus is your reason, that he broke into reality 2,000 years ago and he died on the cross for the sins of humanity for all time? And what he asks from you this morning is to have faith, to put your trust in him, to seek forgiveness for your wrongdoing, to seek forgiveness for your sin, and have a final word stamped on your heart and your life for all eternity.